At 2:20 hours on July 5, 1943, the Soviet guns opened fire. The German tank crews heard it before they understood it. A sound that began as distant thunder on the horizon and grew within seconds into something that shook the earth beneath their steel hulls. Shells came screaming out of the summer darkness, tearing apart the assembly areas where thousands of German vehicles had been staged for the greatest armored offensive the Wehrmacht had ever attempted. Men who had been sitting quietly in their hatches, checking instruments, waiting for the order to advance, suddenly found themselves under a bombardment so intense that veteran soldiers who had fought from Moscow to the Mediterranean could not find words for it afterward. This was not supposed to happen. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German attack was scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock hours. The plan called for German artillery to fire first, German infantry to advance first, German tanks to roll forward into a Soviet line that would be reeling from the opening blow. Every briefing, every map, every operational order had been built on that sequence. The Germans would strike. The Soviets would absorb. That was how it was supposed to work. Instead, Soviet shells were falling among German tank formations 40 minutes before a single German gun had fired. Along a front stretching nearly 250 miles across the Russian steppe, over 3,000 German tanks and assault guns sat waiting in their attack positions. The men inside them were the finest armored crews the Third Reich could assemble, veterans of France and North Africa and 3 years of savage war on the Eastern Front. Their vehicles represented the absolute peak of German engineering. The massive Tiger I heavy tanks, their 88mm guns capable of destroying any Soviet tank at ranges beyond 2,000 meters. The brand new Panther medium tanks, rushed from the factories with their sloped armor and long-barreled guns, which Hitler himself had declared would restore German dominance on the battlefield. Ferdinand tank destroyers mounting guns so powerful their crews believed nothing in the Soviet arsenal could survive a direct hit. The salient they were preparing to attack was called Kursk, a bulge in the Soviet lines roughly 150 miles wide and 100 miles deep, jutting westward into German-held territory like an invitation. Inside that bulge, German planners estimated, were enough Soviet divisions to justify the risk. Pinch off the salient at its base, trap everything inside, and the Red Army would suffer a blow from which it could not recover before winter. The shells continued to fall. In the darkness, German officers pressed their radios to their ears and tried to make sense of what was happening. The Soviets had never done this before. Counter-preparation barrages required precise intelligence about enemy positions, timing, and intentions. To fire this accurately, this early, the Soviets would have needed to know not just that the attack was coming, but exactly when. Somewhere in the chain of command, a question was forming that no one yet dared ask aloud. How did they know? The answer to that question would not come until after the war. In the summer of 1943, Adolf Hitler believed he was building the most powerful offensive force in the history of armored warfare. He was not wrong about that. He was catastrophically wrong about everything else. Operation Citadel had been in planning since March. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. 2 German army groups would attack simultaneously from the north and south shoulders of the Kursk salient, driving toward each other like the blades of a pair of scissors. They would meet near the town of Kursk itself, encircling and destroying the Soviet forces trapped inside. It was the same formula that had worked in 1941, the same deep encirclement that had swallowed entire Soviet armies whole. Hitler was certain it would work again. What he needed, he decided, was more tanks. The original attack date was May 1943. Then Hitler postponed it to June, waiting for more Panthers to roll off the assembly lines. Then he postponed it again to July, adding still more time for the new Ferdinand tank destroyers to arrive from the factories. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who would lead the southern assault, argued repeatedly that delay was fatal, that every week Germany waited was another week the Soviets used to strengthen their defenses. Hitler overruled him each time. The Panthers would make the difference. The Tigers would be unstoppable. Wait for the machines. The machines were extraordinary. The Tiger I weighed 57 tons, its frontal armor 100 millimeters thick, its 88mm cannon the most feared anti-tank gun on any battlefield in the world. American and Soviet tank commanders had issued standing orders to their crews. Do not engage a tiger directly. Call for artillery. Call for air support. Do anything except trade shots with that gun at range, because the range battle was already lost before it began. 134 Tigers were committed to Citadel, and German planners considered each one worth several of anything the Soviets could put against it. The Panther was newer, faster, and in theory even more capable. Its sloped armor could deflect shells that would punch through older German designs. Its 75mm high-velocity gun could penetrate Soviet armor at distances that made the engagement one-sided. Hitler had personally championed the Panther program, accelerating production schedules, demanding more vehicles faster. The acceleration had consequences no one in the Führer's headquarters was willing to speak plainly about. The Panther's Maybach engine ran hot. The transmission was fragile under the stress of a 45-ton vehicle pushing hard across rough terrain. During the approach marches to the assembly areas, before a single shot had been fired in anger, Panther engines caught fire spontaneously in the summer heat. Transmissions seized. Track links snapped. Of the roughly 200 Panthers committed to the offensive, nearly half broke down mechanically on the first day alone. They sat on the roads and in the fields, burning or simply silent, blocking the vehicles behind them. Germany's most advanced weapon had defeated itself before the battle began. While German mechanics worked through the night trying to fix broken Panthers, the men who would stop them had already been waiting for months. The Soviet soldiers inside the Kursk salient had spent the entire spring digging. Not just trenches, but an entire underground world stretching in every direction. 8 defensive lines, one behind the other, each one designed to slow the German advance. Bleed it, exhaust it, and hand it to the next line to bleed again. The work had begun in April, when the spring mud was still thick on the steppe. By July, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers and civilians had moved enough earth to bury a small mountain range. The numbers were staggering in the way that only Soviet numbers could be. 3,000 miles of trenches dug by hand. 400,000 anti-tank mines buried in the black soil. Some sectors packed so densely that a vehicle could not cross a single mile without encountering 2,400 mines laid in its path. Anti-tank guns positioned not randomly but in carefully calculated fields of fire, each gun covering the ground where the guns beside it could not reach, so that a German tank trying to avoid one barrel would drive into the sights of another. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had designed the trap personally. Zhukov was not a gentle man or a patient one. He had saved Moscow in 1941 when everyone around him believed the city was lost. He had organized the encirclement at Stalingrad that destroyed an entire German army. He understood the German way of war better than almost any Soviet officer alive, understood the deep love German commanders had for the bold stroke, the dramatic breakthrough, the encirclement that swallowed armies whole. He intended to use that love against them. His plan was simple and brutal. Let the Germans attack. Let them drive into the defensive belts and spend their tanks and their men against prepared positions. Absorb everything they could throw. Then, when the German armored fist had punched itself empty against 8 lines of Soviet steel, unleash the reserves that no German intelligence officer knew existed. Those reserves were the secret that made everything else possible. The Soviet High Command had spent months building a strategic reserve force behind the Kursk salient that dwarfed anything the Germans had assembled for the offensive. 1.3 million soldiers, 20,000 artillery pieces, 3,600 tanks held back from the front, fresh and fueled and waiting for the order that Zhukov would give at exactly the right moment. The Germans had no idea. British intelligence, working from decoded German communications, had given Stalin the German order of battle weeks before the attack. The Lucy spy network operating out of Switzerland had provided operational details so precise that Soviet commanders knew which German divisions would attack which Soviet positions on which roads. When the German tank crews climbed into their hatches on the night of July 4th and checked their instruments and waited for dawn, every gun that would kill them was already aimed at the ground beneath their tracks. They were not hunting. They were being hunted. The German attack began in earnest as the sun rose on July 5th, and within hours the commanders who had planned it understood that something was deeply wrong. In the north, Field Marshal Walter Model sent his 9th Army forward against the Soviet lines near Panirai and Alkavatka. His tanks rolled into ground that seemed to swallow them. The Soviet defensive belts did not break cleanly the way French lines had broken in 1940 or Soviet lines had broken in the summer of 1941. They bent, absorbed, and held. German tanks crossed the first line of trenches only to find another line behind it, and another behind that, each one manned by soldiers who had been waiting in the dark earth for precisely this moment. Model had planned to advance 60 miles in the first days of the offensive. By the end of the first week, his army had gained 6 miles of scorched steppe purchased with blood that could not be replaced. Inside a tiger moving through that ground, the world reduced itself to a narrow rectangle of armored glass and the shapes moving within it. The heat inside a buttoned-up tank on a July afternoon on the Russian steppe reached temperatures that made men dizzy and slow. The noise was continuous, the engine roar and the shriek of the tracks and the percussion of incoming rounds striking the hull, some glancing away, some not. German crews who survived those first days described the experience in the same words, over and over. They had not known the ground could hold so many guns. They had not known there could be so many mines. A mine did not destroy a tiger. It did something in some ways worse. It blew off a track, leaving 70 tons of irreplaceable machinery sitting motionless in a minefield, while Soviet anti-tank guns registered on the stationary target and Soviet infantry moved through the smoke toward it with satchel charges and gasoline. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Ferdinand tank destroyers suffered worst of all. Their designers had given them the most powerful anti-tank gun on the battlefield, mounted inside armor so thick that Soviet shells simply could not penetrate it at normal combat ranges. What their designers had not given them was a hull-mounted machine gun. The Ferdinand could destroy a Soviet tank at 2,000 meters. It could not stop a single Soviet soldier who crawled close enough to press a satchel charge against its rear grille and pull the pin. Crews died inside vehicles that nothing in the Soviet arsenal could kill from the front, burned alive by infantrymen who had simply walked up behind them. In the south, the SS Panzer Corps made better progress, driving hard toward a rail junction town called Prokhorovka. Their Tigers cleared ground that Model's forces could not. Their momentum was real. German headquarters watched the southern advance and felt something cautiously resembling hope. That hope had a destination, and the Soviets had already chosen it for them. July 12, 1943 began with fog lying low across the field south of Prokhorovka, and within it, on both sides of the line, engines were already running. Zhukov had made his decision 3 days earlier. The SS Panzer Corps was pushing too hard, gaining too much ground in the south despite everything the defensive belts had cost them. If they broke through toward Prokhorovka, they would crack the entire southern face of the salient open. He reached for the reserve he had been holding back since April. The 5th Guards Tank Army, nearly 600 tanks and self-propelled guns, had been waiting behind the lines for exactly this moment. Its commander, General Pavel Rotmistrov, received his orders at midnight. He was to attack at dawn. He was to stop the SS Panzer Corps regardless of the cost. Rotmistrov understood what the orders meant. His T-34 tanks were outranged by the Tigers facing him. At long distance, the engagement was already decided in Germany's favor. A Tiger could punch through a T-34 at 2,000 meters. A T-34 could not reliably penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at any range that felt safe. There was only one answer to that mathematics. Close the distance until it no longer mattered. He ordered his tank commanders to drive directly at the German line at maximum speed, closing the gap before the Tigers could use their range advantage, getting so near that the geometry of the battlefield would equalize what the engineering had not. At 50 meters, a T-34's gun could find the weak points in German armor. At 50 meters, the Tiger's superiority in range and optics meant nothing. It would be brutal and it would be costly, and there was no other way. At approximately 8:30, the fog began to lift. The two armored forces saw each other across the fields outside Prokhorovka and accelerated toward the collision. What followed was unlike anything either side had experienced in 3 years of war on the Eastern Front. Nearly 1,000 tanks converged in a corridor barely 5 miles wide, squeezed between a railway embankment to the east and the Sel River to the west. The narrow ground meant German commanders could not spread their formations, could not use their superior range, could not maneuver to flank the oncoming Soviet armor. The battlefield had been compressed into something that resembled less a military engagement than a collision between two trains on the same track. The sky turned black before noon. Burning tanks sent columns of oily smoke high enough to be visible 40 miles away. Men who survived described a battlefield so thick with destroyed vehicles that crews abandoning burning tanks had to climb from hull to reach open ground. The heat from the fires was felt hundreds of yards away. By evening, hundreds of tanks lay destroyed across those few square miles of Russian farmland. Germany had reached its furthest point. It had nothing left to push with. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front changed hands that afternoon and never changed back. Hitler canceled Operation Citadel on July 13. 2 days after Prokhorovka, with his southern spearhead exhausted and his northern assault already stopped cold, he summoned his commanders and told them the offensive was over. The Allied landings in Sicily had forced him to divert forces to Italy. The Eastern Front would have to wait. His generals did not tell him what they understood clearly. There was no waiting. There was only retreating. The Soviet counteroffensives came immediately, without pause, without mercy. Operation Kutuzov struck the northern shoulder of the salient on July 12, the same day as Prokhorovka, time to prevent Model from sending reserves southward. Operation Rumiantsev hit the southern shoulder on August 3, driving through German lines that had spent their strength on the failed offensive and had nothing left to absorb another blow. The same divisions that had attacked 6 weeks earlier now fell back across the same ground they had purchased with such cost, retreating through the minefields they had crossed going forward, past the burned hulks of their own tanks still sitting where they had stopped. The losses Germany absorbed at Kursk and in the counteroffensives that followed were not merely large. They were the kind of losses that alter the shape of a war permanently. Roughly 250 German tanks were destroyed outright during Citadel itself. Hundreds more were damaged beyond rapid repair. 54,000 German casualties in the first week of fighting alone represented divisions that could not be rebuilt before winter arrived. The Panther tanks that had caught fire on the approach march, the Ferdinand crews who had burned inside their invincible hulls, the Tigers that had driven into pre-aimed anti-tank guns at Prokhorovka, none of it could be replaced at the rate the factories required. Germany's synthetic fuel plants were already under Allied bombing. Her tank production lines were already being disrupted. She had committed her last genuine strategic reserve of armored strength to a battle that had been anticipated, prepared for, and waiting since April. 6 weeks after Kursk, Soviet forces recaptured Kharkov. It was the third time the city had changed hands in the war, and it would be the last. Germany never took it back. The line on the Eastern Front moved in one direction from that summer forward, grinding westward through Ukraine and Poland and eventually into Germany itself, carried by armies that Zhukov's patient strategy had preserved for exactly this purpose. The field outside Prokhorovka is quiet now. A church stands there, the Church of the Apostles Peter and Paul, built as a memorial to everyone who died in those few square miles of Russian farmland on July 12, 1943. Its bell rings once for every soldier who fell. The names of the dead are carved into its walls in letters worn smooth by decades of Russian winters. Tourists walk the ground where the tanks burned. Few understand how completely everything changed in those hours. Germany arrived at Prokhorovka with the most powerful armored force in history. It left with nothing it could not afford to lose. Could not afford any of it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.